beginning of each regular Planning Commission meeting, we allow time for a comment period where anyone can speak to up to 3 minutes for any topic that doesn't appear on the agenda. So if there's anyone here that came to speak who wants to speak about something that's not on the agenda, please come forward now. All right, seeing none. Before we begin, I want to discuss several possible changes to the agenda. We have 4 zoning cases in new business that do not have CAC votes, and typically we don't hear those cases until we have a CAC vote. Z39, 19, 1031 North Rogers Lane, Z41, 19 Millbrook and North Hills, Z42, 19, 5709, 5712, and 5716 Norcrest Street, and Z43, 19 Leesville Road. Is there anyone who came to speak on any of those from the public? Were you here representing the applicant, or are you here as the applicant?
No, I'm here as a resident of the neighborhood.
Okay. Is there any way, which case are you here to speak on?
Z4119.
4119. Is there any way that you could come back when we hear those cases after the CAC discussion?
It is possible, but this is the first chance that I have had a chance to voice my opinion as a neighborhood landowner on this particular case.
Right, I understand. There will be more opportunities at the CAC and here again. So if you can hold, we'd much appreciate it because we have a very long agenda today. Is that workable for you?
That is workable.
All right.
I would like to make one statement, though.
All right, please come to the podium. And you're limited to 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to address the committee. I think it's important that Raleigh is in the process of reviewing these plans, and I appreciate what you're doing in that effort. We are concerned that the request to increase the zoning on C4119 to a much more higher density will not match the existing neighborhood and create further traffic problems, which are only being increased by further development within that area as well. So I do ask, and I want to make a comment, that I have a degree from North Carolina State University as a forester, and I had a chance to meet several people in the design school, and one of their comments was, design like you give a damn. And I hope that you as planners will plan like you give a damn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So can we get your name and address
Yes.
for the record?
Yeah, Carl, K-A-R-L, Nygaard, N-Y-G-A-R-D, 5889 North Hills Drive.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
We'll come back again for further meetings.
All right, thank you. Is there anyone else here that came from the public to speak on any of these 4 cases? Okay. So the CAC vote for Z3919 is, well, I don't know when the date is for that. So is there someone here representing Z3919? Okay.
Good morning, Don Belk, City Planning, the case manager for Z39. It's my understanding that the applicant will present Z39 at the Southeast CAC meeting this Thursday evening and return for a vote at that meeting in January, which I believe is the 9th of January.
So we can defer this to January 14th?
Correct.
All right. So we will defer Z3919 to January 14th. Z41, 19, so let's see, do we know when the CAC vote is for that one?
You can defer this as well to the 14th of January.
Okay.
They will be voting Monday, December 16th.
All right, and Z42, 19.
That vote is scheduled for next Tuesday, the 17th.
So we can pick that up the 14th of January as
Yes.
well. Thank you. And Z43, we heard from,
That will be probably not voted on until the evening of January 14th.
so you've requested for us to hear this on the 14th, but our preference is, can you come forward to the podium? I'm sorry. Our preference is to hear it after the vote, but you've asked for us to hear it on the 14th.
Well, certainly we'll go along with the Planning Commission's wishes.
Okay, thank
Have it
you.
the 28th.
So we'll pick it up the 28th. Thank you.
Yeah, if it's worth it to you, I have had quite a bit of correspondence about that case,
Oh, okay,
so there is
Yeah, and that
a
was
bit
the
of
reason I
interest.
thought
Mhm.
we'd like to have it in 2 bites,
okay,
because get some feedback from the commission, and we can have some opportunity for neighbors to comment.
okay.
It's up to you.
Does anyone feel strongly here about which date?
I wouldn't be opposed to hearing it on the 14th, just to get familiar with the case.
All right, so since there's quite a bit of discussion, we'll take it on the 14th of January.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, so getting into old business. So for old business, we typically have heard the case before, which means that we typically have to vote to provide more time for the public to speak if they've spoken before. However, Z1516 is a case that we did not get to hear in the Committee of the Whole because we didn't have quorum for Committee of the Whole. And so we're kind of taking up the business of the Committee of the Whole here. So we will allow public input. I think we will keep it down to the 10 minutes per side as per normal, unless we need to look at extending that time. So let's go ahead and hear Z1516 Raven Ridge Road, which was discussed in one Committee of the Whole meeting, and we missed the second Committee of the Whole due to lack of quorum.
Correct, right. So, right, this case did begin in Committee of the Whole, as all PDs do. But since this is the first appearance here, I will give a bit of a recap. I know we have a long road ahead of us this morning, so I'll try to keep it to the point. But the request, as a refresher, is 20 acres in North Raleigh, currently zoned R4, request a PD, and those water droplets are the Urban Watershed Protection Overlay District. This has received a CAC vote now, which I believe was not the case the last time you heard it, and it was 23 to 56, so against the case, and your deadline is in January. So again, overview, site is now mostly forested. There are a couple of remaining single-family homes that still exist, I believe, and pictures are mostly of trees. So every PD starts with a base zoning district. In this case, it is RX. There is a maximum number of units that can be built of 180. And here's where I will start or mention 2 changes since the last time the Committee of the Whole heard the case, which was staff raised the issue of a technical issue we foresaw during site planning about language about non-residential uses, so they did address that. And then they tweaked the height caps to just reference feet instead of both. So they haven't changed. It's just instead of both and, there's just the foot cap. So just as a reminder, and these colors probably don't show up very well, but there's sort of a split between the height. Everything to the east of the street plan there is limited to 45 feet in height, and then everything to the west in that loop is limited to 60 feet in height, so closer to Falls of Noose, which is on the west side of the site. There's a parkway frontage. Standards apply, save for one about pedestrian access requirements, and the Urban Watershed Protection Overlay District is in place. So those rules require 40% forestation of the site, either tree conservation or replanting. So the main difference being between the current entitlement and the requested is going from about 4 units per acre to 9, and the building type. So it would permit townhouse and apartment building types. Every PD requires a TIA. So this one, identified 2 intersections that would be operating at level of service F, but also concluded that that would happen in what's called the no-build scenario. So if this site remained as trees, they would still be operating at level of service F, and the contribution to the site would be marginal. So no real strong recommendation from the TIA. The master plan does reference a dedicated left turn lane on Raven Ridge as being part of the development. So that will happen, but no other traffic improvements were required. PDs do let you relax some standards. So I have a couple slides listing those. This is 5 that will not apply. So build to ground floor elevation, transparency, amenity area, and block perimeter. And a couple of modifications. So as I mentioned, the parkway frontage has one part of it that's changed. The neighborhood transition is a real technical thing that I think will not really affect anything based on what's built there today. And then street trees can be closer, which my guess is to accommodate the forestation requirements, but the applicant can speak to that. So during the committee meeting, there were some issues that were focused on building height and building massing, transparency in building materials, buffering and screening, and then the stormwater. Members of the public had raised question about how the stormwater pond will be accessed. So there have been some changes that address some of those things. So in terms of massing, there is a new limit to a horizontal dimension of any building to 400 feet and no more than 8 units. So divide 180 by 8 and you would get the number of units per building. And then vinyl siding uses an accent material, and there's a lot more language to that. Should anyone architecturally minded care, I can go through that, but it should be in the backup. In terms of grading and screening, there was a change to the Zone A of the neighborhood transition area about grading, so saying that if the land is disturbed in that area, so in Zone A, you theoretically might build a fence or a wall and then plant some trees, which all require land disturbance. So grading would either be restored to the original condition or graded away from the residential properties on the east side of the site. They also added a definition of what an opaque buffer is. So there's a list of how many trees of what size and how many feet they need to be. So there is a couple of reference of opaque buffer, and the code doesn't define what that is. So the master plan has defined what that is. Pardon my throat also. So request is consistent with the future land use map, which is office and residential mixed use. Consistent with urban form, so the parkway frontage standards make that consistent, and consistent with the comprehensive plan overall. And a number of policies about infill and housing, and watershed management. There is a area plan applied to, or in this area, so consistent with most of those policies. Inconsistent with one policy from the area plan that particularly pertains to this site, in all but name, which says, so the parts in green are the parts that that the PD is inconsistent with. So the plan policy says there should be no apartments and there should be a height limit of 37 feet average and a maximum of 40 feet. So the entitlement fails on both those, the maximum and the average. The only other outstanding issue that remains is some language that mostly I identified as probably being a question at site plan. Some of that was taken care of, some not. A pretty weak issue. I don't think it'll just be a question to work out at the time of site plan, so a degree of uncertainty, but I don't think a real technical problem that I'm gonna force. And so there is just the 14th is the last time before the deadline that you have the opportunity to hear this case. So that is all I have. Are there any questions?
Any questions for staff? I have one. Could you roll back to the guidance? Yes, there on the Fossil News area plan. So apartments are included in this proposal.
They are not prohibited, right?
They're not prohibited. And the height difference between what is asked for here and what is proposed is what?
So the two height caps, so this is a maximum of 40, and the two height caps are 60 and 45. And then the average, I'm not sure, that would depend on, I think, on the number of buildings in each zone, but somewhere between 40 and 65, I imagine, probably closer, 45 and 60, probably closer to the 60 given the amount of land area.
Okay. So we're looking at
so-
20 feet,
so-
20 additional feet
Yeah.
over the guidance here.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you, I appreciate it. All right, so any other questions?
Yeah, I did have, so Zone A is the one along Falls of News?
No, so that is,
Where does that grading
so in a
lie?
In a neighborhood transition, there's the residential, the neighboring residential house, and then the Zone A is the first between 10 and 50 feet, most likely 10 in this case, of the property.
Oh, so this isn't, okay, all right.
So the parkway frontage does require a 50 feet of planting along Falls of Neuse. So this is the transition, and it does reference them by PIN number, but it would be these properties. I think it references all of that by PIN.
Where are you pointing? I didn't see.
Sorry,
Oh,
we'll try pink. So all of the residential, this all requires is the neighborhood transitions, Zone A, B, and C. In this case, C does not apply. So when the Zone A is disturbed here, they're going to grade it.
they're gonna have to grade it back toward their own property.
Right, either back towards the site internally or whatever it is existing. Yeah, is the way the condition's worded.
There was, I'll ask the applicant, I guess, but there was a question of how you would have access to that pond
Mm-hmm.
down the bottom of the hill.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know the answer to that?
Not at this point. I think whatever site plan they would, stormwater reviewer would have that question for them. So there is no specificity in the master plan of that, but I think it would be an issue when they do get final permits.
But it would be required.
Yeah, definitely.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, so the applicant and supporters will have 10 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the Planning Commission. Michael Birch with Longleaf Law Partners here on behalf of the property owner. Appreciate Ira's kind of summary of the changes that we've made since the October committee of the whole meeting. I want to touch on a few of them and some of the, also two of the emails. Well, I'll try and use this. Two of the emails that you received. So the first with regard to stormwater. Two things. One, in terms of access to the stormwater facility, and then two, you received an email, again, this was prior to, I think, the October committee of the whole meeting, from a resident off Sandusky Lane about some drainage she was experiencing. Just on that, our proposed kind of outlet for the stormwater is way beyond her house. It runs way to the north, off-site, and so there'll be no impact on her property. In terms of access to the BMP, if it's kind of in this area here, there are actually easement rights in existence today that provides access back to this area through that way. So we could use those existing easement rights to provide access to the BMP, or we could also accommodate it within the development depending on topography. There is a significant amount of topography along Raven Ridge, but we do have a means to get back there, and that'll be kind of more worked out in detail at the site plan stage. With regard to massing, we did provide no longer than 400 feet. That was more for the apartment type building, and for townhomes, no more than 8 townhome units. And we'll just touch on, Madam Chair, your question about the apartment building type relative to the policy. The apartment building type allows both apartment units, but it's also the only building type that accommodates residential condo units, where you have stacked condo units. And so kind of from the beginning, that's been intent of this project is to have for sale condo units kind of stacked, and the apartment building type is the only way to accommodate that. So that's why we've continued to include that building type. With regard to the architectural standards, we did clarify some of the language, limited the use of vinyl siding. With regard to transparency, again, this is because of the parkway frontage, it's an internally oriented development, but because of the topography, most of these units will have to be front-loaded. To the extent they have garages, will be front-loaded garages, and so we have continued to not commit to a minimum transparency at the ground level. We have still committed to the code requirements for transparency above that first level. With regard to height, again, we are continuing to move forward with the request for 45 feet, kind of in this area here, with the balance being 60 feet in height. We have had discussions with our neighbors to the east, south, and then also have been cognizant about the relationship of these buildings to Falls and Raven Ridge. At the CAC meeting, we detailed kind of the planned grading for the site, and would note that kind of in this area here along Falls of Noose Road, again 50 feet into the site, those the ground floor elevation of those units are anywhere from 10 to 20 feet below the level of Falls of Noose Road. So we're 50 feet into the site, and a good floor down, or 10 feet down below Falls of Noose Road, and that is similar along Raven Ridge Road, between about 8 to 15 feet along Raven Ridge Road, 50 feet off the property line.
So, Director Bowers, our timer's not going, sorry.
What did you say?
The timer's not going, so.
I'll,
So, sorry about that. I
No,
don't
no,
know how much time you have left.
no, I'll
So-
I'll keep my other comments short.
Okay.
I would say the other email that you received, in addition to Helen Spain about the stormwater matter, was from Janice Culver in the Raven Point townhome community. We spoke with her at length prior to the CAC meeting, at the CAC meeting, and that was, again, something we had to remove from the PD to say that we were going to enter into this separate agreement with Raven Point. That's still the plan. Her in particular was concerned about the driveway location on Raven Ridge. Again, just through those discussions, she communicated to us that she was comfortable and said that she voted in favor of the case at the CAC meeting. So I just wanted to touch on that email. And just in closing, again, reiterate, consistent with the future land use map, consistent with the key policies of the comprehensive plan, including compatibility, consistent with the urban form map, preserving the character of Falls of Noose Road and Raven Ridge Road, which was a key point of the Falls North area plan process. I think it's reasonable and in the public interest because it increases housing variety in an area that is dominated by single-family homes. We are limiting the traffic impacts well below previous proposals for this site that included significant amount of retail, as well as we are actually reducing, if you take a look at the TIA letter in your packet, at 180 multifamily units, we are actually reducing the PM peak hour impact, and that is where Falls and Raven Ridge and Falls and Dunn are an F. We're actually reducing our trip generation potential by 3 trips in the PM peak hour, and it's a 0 increase in the AM peak hour. Again, preserving the character of the area and providing an appropriate transition to the east. So here to answer any questions that the commission may have, and would also ask, if there are public comments, that we have an opportunity to address those on the backside.
2 minutes, yes.
Thanks.
So does anyone have any questions for Mr. Birch? Yes, Mr. Gary.
Michael, what was the rationale for taking stories out of the height? So you had 4 stories or 60 feet, now it's just 60 feet.
Yeah, so throughout the process, we have tried to figure out how the site is ultimately going to be graded So there is a basement, there was anticipated to possibly be a basement in some of these units, possibly, or particularly on the backside. Now, since we initiated this case, there have been, I believe, 2 text changes that have affected, and there's actually one pending that affects how a basement counts. Does it count as a story? When does it count as a story? Additionally, there's always been the plan, and again, kind of been a part of our discussion since day one, about rooftop access for some of these units. And there is always discussion about at what point does the rooftop access constitute a story. If it's anything more than a stairwell, if there's any additional conditioned space up on the roof, then that could count as a story. And so, given the uncertainty with the grading and how basements are being determined and how that rooftop area would be determined, we decided to go purely with the feet regulation. Now, stories are typically a regulator of density in addition to height. We maintain our 180 unit cap, so this isn't a way to increase density, and I would say we're keeping our kind of feet limitation, and given how you now calculate that based on taking the average of the average grade, that will take into account height related to a basement unit. So we feel like we're still addressing kind of the overall issue of height, but don't want to create an issue on the back end if we need to add basements or if there's future discussion about the rooftop amenity as well.
Any other questions for the applicant? All right. I have one question. So the applicant, did they purchase this property after the finalization of the area plan that had the guidance?
No.
So they purchased it before the completion and adoption of the area plan?
That's correct.
Okay. Anybody else have questions for the applicant? All right. Is there anybody here to speak in support of this case? All right. So is there anyone here to speak in opposition to this case? Okay. So you have a max of 10 minutes, 2 minutes per person, and please try not to repeat information we've heard from each other.
Is there anybody but me? I couldn't possibly talk for 10 minutes.
Okay.
I'm Tim Niles. I reside at 11509 Midlavian Drive in Raleigh. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak about the case before you today. I was here and spoke about this same case in October. You may recall that I ended by noting that the group of residents who developed the small area plan originally asked for a limit of 2 stories in anticipation that the developer would ask for 4 stories and we could compromise at 3. I had hoped at the time the developer's proposal for 4 stories and 60 feet was a similar opening position strategy on their part, and that they would ultimately heed your advice from last time and compromise with the residents on height in order to move closer to consistency with the small area plan. Just as a note, they didn't purchase it prior to the approval of the small area plan, but they attended the meetings and were fully aware in the process of the small area plan. And from the beginning, the small area plan always was about height. Sadly, that's not the case. The applicant has made no changes to the proposal at all. In fact, today I heard them finally explain why they wanted to eliminate stories. It's because they intend to go for basements and rooftops, which haven't been discussed at CAC. Ultimately, as you noted, the SAP states 40 feet max, 37 average. You may also recall another gentleman, a resident of Raven Point from across the street of this proposal. He spoke at the last meeting. He noted Raven Point has a mix of townhomes. Some are 3-story and that a maximum of 30 feet in height. This, of course, shows that 3-story residences can be built at less than 45 feet. Thus, a 4-story building doesn't need 60 feet in height. I don't believe the residential units at Raven Point are substandard living units at 30 feet in height versus 45 feet in height. I certainly don't believe a four-story residence needs to be 60 feet in height in order to be viable in today's market. I myself live in a home with 9-foot ceilings. I'm not ashamed of it. I don't consider it to be substandard housing. I would also point out that the livable square footage of a 3 or 4-story building doesn't change based on its height unless you plan on sticking a basement
Mr.
under it or a
Niles.
rooftop.
You've hit 2 minutes.
Oops,
So,
sorry.
If you could conclude.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Is there anyone else here to speak in opposition? Please come forward. You have 2 minutes.
My name's Marshall Clausen. I live at 10421 Blue Dunn Way in Raven Point, which is across the street. I'm here to talk about the stormwater. I know that they are supposed to follow the stormwater regulations under Article 9 of the UDO, such as doing that, they have to follow the stormwater design manual. And in that, it talks about having basins, and one of the bullets under there is to provide for maintenance access, minimum of 25 feet wide. Provisions should be made for vehicle access at a 4-to-1 slope. On the map, there is no provision for access to the south because of Sandusky. You can't access from the east because of what's the name of that neighborhood? Thorntonbury Crest. And to the north, you've got Lehigh Justice, which is a private road. So they would have to have access from here up along their eastern property to the church. Therefore, their 50-foot buffer that's along that eastern property would have to be adjusted somehow for access of that 25-foot road.
Thank you. Is there anyone else here to speak in opposition? Please come forward. You'll have 2 minutes.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Jerry Galt, G-O-L-T. I'm at 10325 Dapping Drive in Raven Point. I'm a 46-year citizen of Raleigh, 30 years in Northridge, and 16 in Raven Point. My children grew up in Raleigh, went to Raleigh schools, teachers in Raleigh schools in Wake County, and my grandchildren also have gone to Raleigh schools. My kids graduated from East Carolina. I have one grandchild in East Carolina and another one that is preparing to go. With that all being said, we love Raven Point, and we want to stay in Raven Point for the rest of our years, my wife and myself. We're both retired. I work part-time for Precision Walls. I was a vice president, and thankfully, I can add, my 32 years of experience to the company. We've done a lot of work in downtown Raleigh, but that leads me back to Raven Point. Myself and many of the people in the community were at a meeting on September 16th where the developer presented basically the same thing here. Yes, there are some height issues. There is an opaque buffer issue. However, the people that I've spoken to are very much in favor of getting something in there. Initially, the group of people didn't want a shopping center. There's no shopping center. They didn't want apartments. There's no apartments. I don't know what they want. They probably don't want something that in there at all. But I can tell you this. I don't like to use the word silent majority, but there are a lot of people that don't speak up, especially at CAC meetings, because they're afraid of being bullied and shouted down. So, with that being said, I'm not a bully. I'm telling you my opinion, and there are others conceivably in the future that hopefully will get up before the City Council and voice exactly what I'm saying. Thank you very much.
Mr. Galt, are you in favor of this particular proposal then?
What's that?
Are you in favor of this particular proposal?
I am very much in favor,
Okay.
as are others.
Thank you. We don't usually have rebuttal for, yeah, we can give you a few minutes after we finish the, so is there anyone else here to speak in opposition? So we do have, additional time on the clock. Do we want to hear 2 more minutes, up to 2 more minutes from Mr. Niles? Yes. Okay. All right. Please come forward.
So I'll just finish what I intended to say before. I fully understand the applicant is under the constraints of the 40% forestation rule, feels it's necessary to be able to produce 180 units in order to make development profitable. And I'm not asking them to build fewer than 180 units. I'm simply asking them to do what you suggested at your last meeting and compromise on height, build the 3-story townhomes at a height less than 45 feet, closer to the 30 feet in height from Raven Point, build their 2-over-2 condos at a height much less than 60 feet, fill these homes with all the features and upgrades they want in order to justify the price points they feel necessary to be successful. This case was before the CAC, 70% opposition. I spoke with many attendees after the meeting, and to a one, they each told me they would have voted in favor of the proposal had they compromised in compliance with your advice on height. No one is opposed to the residential development. No one is opposed to the density. It is simply the excessive height and the applicant's unwillingness to compromise. At this point, I'm respectfully asking you to deny the applicant's request based on both the inconsistency with the small area plan and the refusal to compromise on height as directed by the committee of the whole. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else here to speak in opposition? Okay, Mr. Birch, you have 2 minutes to rebut.
Two items with regard to stormwater access. Again, we have easement rights over Lehigh Justin Court that comes down this way. So we will not have an impact to our buffer along the east. With regard to height, I believe just in terms of folks who you have not heard from in opposition, anybody here? I believe no one here. There might be one or two in Raven Point, and Mr. Niles, who lives a significant way away. I understand there's concern about height with regard to the character of the area. The one thing that we did commit to from day one was preserving the character with that parkway frontage along Raven Ridge and Falls of Noose Road. And because those structures will sit at least a floor down below Falls of Noose Road, they'll appear as 3 stories from Falls of Noose Road. From a compromise on height standpoint, to have the housing variety, level of affordability relative to the single-family homes in this area, we can't compromise on height without a compromise on the 40%. I would just be very blunt about that. This is the only development in this area that has had to comply with the 40% regulation. Raven Point did not have to comply with that. Raven Point also was not under the current height calculation measurements, which are significantly different than they were when Raven Point was developed. No longer calculating height to the midpoint of a pitched roof. No longer taking into account, at that time did not take into account average grade in a sloping lot. So there are significant differences between how height was calculated at Raven Point, how height was calculated here, also from a topography standpoint. And that was 30 years ago. Frankly, our development patterns have changed since then.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Birch?
I have a couple. The first question's related to the property in the back or not facing the streets. I just wanted to make sure we have a clear idea of what you're providing in your conditions for that. That's a 45-foot maximum height for those units. And how much of a retaining wall will that have? And there's a really nice rendering here that's showing the vegetation in our packet, but it doesn't show topography. So I just want to make sure I understand what the relationship of that backside is to the neighbors that are behind there, just so we know what we're reviewing.
Great. And so we did provide this exhibit to at the CAC project, but we don't have it in the in your backup here. But we anticipate a retaining wall in this area there that ranges in about 5 to 8 feet. And I believe that's the only retaining wall that we're showing along the backside. From what I can tell from this exhibit, there will be retaining walls here, here, and then a few kind of internal, but in terms of the impact to the properties to the east, it's really in this area here.
So that would be like a 10-foot, 8 to 10-foot retaining wall, and then the structure.
5 to 8 foot.
5 to 8, sorry,
Yep.
that's a big difference. And then the structure above it, essentially.
Correct. And
Okay.
that retaining wall, obviously, we still have to comply with our Zone A requirements, landscaping requirements, all of that. That's
And
correct.
the topography there, how severe is the slope?
So it kind of is significant running that way as well as kind of this way. And I don't know if Jacob Anderson might be able to speak to a little bit more, but there is quite a bit of slope here.
Here you go. It's 2.8, so it's better than anything the city of Raleigh would require than 4%.
Yeah, that's finished, right?
Yeah, that's finished.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so finished grade, it'll be at 2.5 to 4% grade. Again, that's kind of finished post-grading.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it'll have some impact back there, but it sounds like you're trying to mitigate that as much as you can.
Correct, correct. And again, really from a impact, it's, in terms of property that we don't own, it's really one parcel, yeah.
My other question was just to make sure I understand about the vinyl siding, because I think I'm the one that asked about limiting that. It says to be used as an accent material. Let's see. Flat profile can be used unless it meets the following: bearing wood grain texture, having reveal of 6 inches or more, and being foam backed or beaded. So under those conditions, you could use vinyl siding. Is that correct? Am I understanding that?
Just in that limit, yeah, just that limited instance, but Jake, I don't know if you want.
You'll see in the packet, we added fairly significant upgrades to what the city of Raleigh requires currently to the architectural standards. So the vinyl is just this last-minute request. Typically, in home construction, you'll have certain materials of elements of your home built in vinyl so that it lasts longer. Otherwise, you're constantly painting or replacing things that probably you have on your home today. So.
Yeah, and sometimes PVC is used in those instances as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I did want to note, also saw that there were some, I'm a little disappointed. The way I read this, quite a bit of vinyl siding could be used, not just in accents, but in other conditions. So that's just a note, a personal note from my end, from our discussion in the CAC. I did note that under the landscaping that you are adding additional trees and things like that, which seem like that should be what everybody's doing. So thank you for your attention to that.
Other questions for the applicant? I have another. I wanted to ask about the easement road, or the easement that you currently have to get to the retention pond area. So is that already a dirt road or a road of some sort?
Yes, ma'am. It's been existing for 30, 40, 60 years. We have easements. We bought about 2.5 acres late in the process.
Right.
And those parcels where that stormwater pond would be located do have access to that easement. But I feel pretty confident we can provide a private easement as well through the project and meet City of Raleigh standards.
Okay, thank you.
I would just say to one of the comments, yes, we don't have an exhibit that shows exactly how the stormwater pond is going to be accessed. In the stage where we are at the rezoning stage, conceptual master plan stage, that's not something that, from a city requirement standpoint, that we're required to do. But again, before, or as a part of the concurrent review process, we have got to demonstrate, compliant access to the pond. So whether that's over the easement rights that we have, or whether that's through the project, that will be done.
Okay, thank you. All right. Any other questions for the applicant? If not, let's bring it back.
To the applicant, I want
All
to
right, let's bring it back.
I want to ask staff about the measurement of basements and roof amenities, and why that, and whether that would be an issue. And if you had a 4-story limit on this case, why would that prevent a rooftop access or basement?
All right, well, since Ken's not moving.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm just navigating to make sure I'm quoting from the latest version of the code. With some recent text changes dealing with building height, the standards for basements were tightened up, but mostly in the realm of dealing with larger buildings. There was still an exception for attached and detached dwellings. And I'm trying to remember precisely whether that extended to townhouses or not. And it deals with downward sloping lots, but on many cases with the new tighter regulations, it's not possible to count a basement as an extra story on a sloping lot like it was in the prior version of the code. And without seeing the specific plan here, I'm not entirely sure what could be accommodated. But there was a tightening of the height regulations. The other change that was made, which doesn't really affect stories but does affect how height and feet was measured, was that you used to look at the front, at the building plane facing the street as the primary indicator of height, except on upward sloping lots. Now it's a 4-corner measurement for those buildings. And that is, on sloping sites, effectively lower the achievable height for residential structures.
If I've got a sloping site and my basement is showing more and more and more as we go down the slope, at some point that's going to get counted as an extra story?
That's correct. And the provision in the code for allowing that as an extra story is limited to the detached and attached building types. So that's 1 and 2 family dwellings. Does not include townhouses or multifamily apartment building type.
So it wouldn't apply in this case?
Well, no, they don't get the regulations are more lenient for the detached and attached building types. You're allowed to acquire an extra story through a basement on a sloping lot. You're not allowed to do that with building types other than attached and detached.
Okay. And what about roof access? How's that going to get, I'm not aware that that could be counted as a story.
That's not entirely clear. There was discussion, you may recall, from a rezoning case for a hotel where there was going to be active commercial use on the roof. Did that count as a story or not? For a residential structure, it's not clear to me why having a roof access point would count as an additional story.
Thank you.
All right, let's bring the discussion back to the table. So is there anything that anyone wants to say or discuss about this case at this point?
I'm reading that vinyl siding slide that's up here. Thank you. I think that clarified. It's only within the accent that you can have those dimensions. Thank you.
Mr. Geary?
So the number of stories, I'm not sure what its relevance is. We have 180 units if we had a 5-story building, which would be allowed under this proposal as long as it fit in within 60 feet. And a 5-story building would fit in within 60 feet, generally speaking. And we've preferred in other settings to count stories rather than feet so that we could be more generous with the height of a given story. Am I right? We dispatched with numerical height limits on stories up to 7.
7 and above.
Yeah.
So, and the reason for that was, for making the distinction 7 was twofold. Under the prior standards, the average floor-to-floor height in a 7-story building was significantly lower than the height categories of 5 and below. And secondly, 3, 4, and 5-story zoning is much more likely to be found in proximity to lower-scale residential. 7-story zoning is typically found, 7 and above is typically found downtown and in our more intense mixed-use centers where differences in height and feet are less likely to have an impact on residentially zoned areas.
Yeah, it's puzzling to me.
Could you use your microphone, Mr.
Yeah,
Reed?
I didn't have a problem with the 4-story height limit here, and I understood the proposal to be for stacked condominiums, 2 floors and then 2 floors above. But that's not necessarily what will be built here under this rezoning. We could have a 5-story apartment building up to 60 feet with basements partially exposed. I just point that out. I'm thinking about whether I object to that or not.
Anyone else want to discuss this case?
You know, too much, but I mean, I can sympathize with the height and basement issue. I've dealt with it, and it's very challenging right now to, especially on slopes that have I mean, this has 30 to 40 feet of grade change, and if you think building to building, measurement off the road, like the way that when you go through the site review process that you measure heights and do those calculations, it can be, it can really force the project into some really ugly corners. So I honestly see this as a little bit of an advantage for them to have more flexibility and fluidity, I'd hope, you know, and especially going through site review and citing the buildings, but.
Well, they've
Use your microphone, please.
they've gone to community meetings and told neighbors, interested residents, that they're going to build 2-over-2 condos, but this application could result in, have you not? You're shaking your head. But this application could result in simply 5-story apartment building. I guess I'm really asking Michael.
Is that a question for staff, really?
I think it's a question for Michael.
Well, I mean, staff can tell us whether the code will allow it based on the conditions that are proposed. Could the current case as proposed allow 5 stories with a
I think theoretically, yes, and
apartment?
that's the issue they're trying to avoid, which is the design of their product not counting something as a story that they don't think is a story.
Right.
I think before, when it was feet and stories, when we have those types of conditions, the more restrictive thing applies. So you can't have, if it says 4 stories, you can't have it be 63 feet when it says 60, for example.
Right.
And the feet measurement has never changed, so theoretically, yes, there could be some different number of floors depending on what's counted as a story.
So there's no
but
condition there's no condition that says that these will be condos and not apartments.
No, we don't regulate ownership.
So we can't,
That's a
so
character
there's
of
no
the-
condition for that. So we
No, we'll
could
not
get
permit.
apartments. So there's no condition that keeps us from having 5 stories with 60 feet.
No, and to be clear, there is nothing that we would accept from a zoning point of view to regulate who owns or rents
Right.
a building. So the condo, townhouse building type requires a lot for each unit, a fee simple lot. So if you were to do a stacked unit, that would be impossible. You'd have to go, so even if it may look like a townhouse, technically we treat it as an apartment building type. So they have, in my listening and meetings I've attended, have always described it as a 2-over-2, which is not a townhouse from the city of Raleigh's enforcement point of view. That's an apartment building. So whether it winds up being that or does wind up being 4 floors, a unit on each floor, you are correct. I would say the density remains in either case.
I'm not saying it'll be 4 stories of apartments. I'm saying it'll be 5. If this had a 4-story
Potentially.
height limit in it, you have a better chance of getting 2-over-2. That equals 4.
Potentially, yes. But I would say then they would have more room than they need because they're still limited with the number of units. And they'd have to park it. That's also true.
All right. So my one comment is that I'm sad that there wasn't some compromise on the height on this, that we're still at 60 feet and especially now that we don't have stories as part of the measurement. So I'm conflicted about this case. I think the applicant has done things to bring it along, to make it more palatable, but it hasn't done the one thing that I think that would make the neighbors more comfortable with it, and that would be to reduce the height, even down to 50 feet would be helpful, I think. So at this point, I like the idea of having more housing options in the community, but I am disappointed about the height situation. And so at the moment, I'm not feeling like I can support the case. Does anyone else want to comment?
I guess I'm on the other side of it. I think we've gotten a lot of people saying that they value the time and the effort that folks have put in. We've gotten a bunch of emails saying that they support it. We've heard from other people that say they support it.
Sure.
You know, there's no issue with the use from the surrounding neighbors, and the height actually is pretty much there for the rear of the property. It's just the front, which is Falls of Noose, which is a very busy road, and this is stepped down 10 feet from that road, so.
Those are good points,
Yep.
thank you. So does anyone care to make a motion?
I will move approval for this case, that it is in the best interest for the city. It is providing housing options and choice, and, you know, it's developing in a respectful way in this area and is not impacting any kind of real net change in any of the traffic in the area as well.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Any further discussion before we vote? All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
So what was, can you raise your hands, please? All opposed, say no.
No.
No. So it's a 3-3. What do we have to do?
So the motion would,
Rock, paper,
the motion to
scissors.
approval did not
Okay.
pass that. So right now you can make a motion in the opposite to deny. I'm assuming it would be the.
It's probably going to be the same. So
Yeah. So what you're doing, so kind of give you context, you're advising on the comprehensive plan to City Council.
okay.
Advising and recommending. So typically you would have a majority vote to give a consistent advice on that. So I don't know if you guys want to, you know, it's an
Can we
it's an
move it
odd
forward
fit.
without a recommendation and just say that we were evenly split? Is that a
You
possibility?
can, and what you might want to do is have somebody make a motion to deny and state the reasons as Matt did to approve. That way both motions and the reasons would be presented.
Okay, all right. So given that that motion failed, we have someone ready to make a motion in the opposite direction.
Okay, well, I'll move then that we send this forward to City Council without a recommendation.
A motion to deny
Motion.
It would be a motion to deny would be the way it's
is the
framed.
first thing that needs to happen.
Oh, well, that's going to, okay. I'll make a motion to deny. It's going to fail 3-3, right?
Yes.
Okay. I'll move to recommend denial.
Just an opportunity if you want to give to to City Council the reasons why for denial, because you have the reasons that you put in your
Yes,
motion.
so I think this is pretty significantly at variance with the small area plan that applies to the property. Would be helped by a limit on the number of stories, but that's been removed. So that's absent also from the application.
Do we have a second? Second. Any further discussion? All in favor of this motion to deny, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. So those opposed, say no.
No.
So is it 3-3? Okay, so 3-3. So now,
Can I also just update two reasons that it is consistent with the comp plan and the future land use for the record?
okay, thank you. So now we need to make a motion to, or just say we're sending it on without a
I think you can
recommendation.
just send it on without
All right,
recommendation.
so we're sending this forward to City Council without a recommendation.
We'll be prepared to report it out as such
Okay.
at the next council
When
meeting.
is this next council meeting?
January 7th?
Okay,
7th?
all right, thank you. All right. So moving on, we're going on to,
All right. Z619, this has been
Thank you.
before you a couple of meetings over the summer. There was a public hearing held last month. The public hearing was closed, and the city council referred this case back to you to allow for the applicants to modify the request. And that modification was to increase the requested height from 20 stories to 40 stories. The request also included an additional zoning condition that offers affordable housing units as a ratio of the final building. And so I'll go pretty quickly through this. Like I said, we've heard it a few times, and then take any questions. The applicants are here as well. So currently the property is zoned DX5 with the shopfront frontage, and the request is for DX40 with shopfront and conditions. It's inconsistent with the future land use map and the comprehensive plan. The Central CAC did vote in favor of the previous request for 20 stories if affordable housing was provided. Originally, it was not provided. It now is, so it is in line with that Central CAC guidance, albeit the height has doubled. The Planning Commission, you previously made an approval for a recommendation for approval in 6-1. The one no vote was on the condition that affordable housing be provided. That has been provided at this time. Again, the height is different from the previous request. Your deadline for action is your second meeting in February. Very quickly, this is the site. It's most of the block bound by Martin, Davie, West, and Harrington, except for these two parcels here. Just some context, this is the Depot Historic Overlay District, and we've got Union Station to the west, and you can see Red Hat to the southeast. A couple of big zoning cases that were active early on. Adjacent, you can see the Rust Bus site here was approved for 40 stories recently. This case was actually withdrawn. And then finally, just a look at where the planned BRT routes are downtown, of course, with Rust Bus serving as a hub for that transit service. A look at the block, that's CAM, right here. There is the plaza at the front of CAM. This is looking north on Davie Street. You can see the Dillon in the back. These are the two buildings that are not included. This is on West Street. Of course, the West Street extension will come through here at some point, connecting to Cabarrus. Some of your proposed conditions prohibiting high-intensity uses. There's a provision for a 10-foot on average, a minimum of 7-foot pedestrian connection. To complete the block from Martin to Davie, there's offering to preserve the facade of the Martin Street building where CAM currently is. Some restrictions on glazing. Height is regulated by an exhibit, and I'll touch on an outstanding issue there in just a minute. This shows you that exhibit. When the application was revised, the maximum height in the exhibit was remain at 20 stories. So what I would recommend is that you hold the case for 2 weeks, and we can make an amendment to that, because as it stands now, the height is still currently limited to 20 stories and 250 feet. That's not the applicant's intention. They want the full 40-story height. So just amending that before making a recommendation to Planning Commission. More conditions on how to treat buildings on the North Carolina NC Railroad corridor. Buildings there will be treated the same as buildings on public streets, meeting transparency and other requirements. There is an offering to document and photograph and provide to the city's historic preservation staff all of the existing structures on the site that are contributing to the historic district. Site plan will include two 1,500 square foot plazas or open space areas at the two intersections of Martin and West and Martin and Harrington Street. Some standards for screening and for parking decks. And this is the new condition you're seeing for the first time. It provides 3 options for bringing affordable housing units into the site. targeting various levels of the area median income for various terms of length at different percentages. Change here, your entitlement for residential went up pretty significantly over what it was, almost doubled from 20 to 40 stories there. So your density and all of that has increased as well. Future land use map shows the site as community mixed use. Urban form, we are downtown and in a transit-rich area. This is the Downtown West Gateway Plan, which provided the strongest guidance for inconsistency previously with a maximum story height of 4 stories for this block. Of course, it is in excess of that. Downtown West Gateway Plan also originally envisioned some of the transit services at a different location. This is showing the rail and intermodal facility a block to the north. We now know that that takes place here, closer to the subject site. Policy consistency is the same under the previous case. And the recommendations, again, you recommended 6-1. The 1 vote contingent on affordable housing conditions, same in the central CAC. Again, we think you should hold it for 2 weeks, make the change to that, the condition exhibit, and then come back and take your action. Then the applicants are here to speak. If you have questions for them, I'm of course ready for questions.
Just to be clear, we don't have another planning commission meeting this month, correct?
That's right. It will
All right,
be
so it won't be
January
2
14th.
weeks, it'll be 4 weeks?
Yep.
4 weeks, okay.
Could I ask Matt a question? Just remind me, because I meant to look at this and didn't. Is CAM preserved in this rezoning by condition, or is it just the facade?
Just that one historic facade could be deconstructed and brought back. There's nothing that says an institutional or gallery use would or must remain. Gab Smith, representing CAM, is here to speak to that and what their intentions may be long-term. But in terms of what is legally required of them in the zoning conditions, there is nothing that says they must be there indefinitely.
And that has not changed since the last time we heard this case, right? So it is the same as what we voted on previously?
Indeed.
Okay.
Will there be a new CAC vote with the doubled height?
I'm not sure. The applicants were there on Monday last week at the CAC and were not able to present because they were not on the agenda. They will be on the agenda next month at the beginning of January, so they will be there for at least a presentation before you see this again. I'm not sure if they've been requested to vote at the CAC or what exactly is happening there, but they will be back before them early January before your next meeting.
Thank you.
I asked this before, but if we took the Downtown West Gateway plan and actually moved it so that where the bus station is currently, this would be consistent, correct?
Yep, so you raised that question before, and I'll caveat that in saying how the plan was originally drawn had the most high-intensity uses at the front door of the station. The station is not where the plan envisioned it, so I think it's fair to say the plan could have called for more intensity in that location, but that's just not what transpired, but that is reasonable.
Is the bus station, new proposed bus station, in the historic district, or is it just outside of it?
Let me look.
And this is located within, is that correct?
That's correct. The bus station is here, so outside of the district, and we're here inside of the district. The zoning case is, rather.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
We'll bring the applicant forward. You have 10 minutes for you and supporters.
Good morning, Mac Paul, 421 Fayetteville Street. I've got Gab Smith with Cam Raleigh, Gary Fields, Charles Long, center line was here, just had to leave a few moments ago. Primarily, we had a lot of conversation about housing and the conditions in the historic district, which we included. And when we were before you, we spent a lot of time discussing affordable housing, but we're uncomfortable at that point offering a condition. We appreciate you putting this forward with an understanding that the applicant was very intent and genuine in their pursuit, particularly with micro units, is what we had kind of settled on in those conversations. When we got to council, we went to the Growth and Natural Resources Committee, and surprisingly, we didn't anticipate it, but Councilor Stevenson offered the idea of granting additional height if that could get the applicant comfortable with a formal commitment in a zoning condition on affordable housing. There really wasn't, I think it's fair to say, a lot of discussion at council about the height in that location. I think there was a general sense that given its location proximate to Raleigh Union Station, it should be a very dense and high, a taller project. But they wanted to see what we could do if we were granted some additional height. And we did some analysis. The applicants came back to the next meeting and said, if we feel like if that would get a comfort with taking the risk of a formal conditions, making it, settled that you would have to do X amount of affordable housing. So we followed the template that the city had created earlier this year and had been used by a couple of cases that just preceded us. And because it did require a change in the height to making it less restrictive at that point after the public hearing was called, the city council had to refer us back to planning commission instead of being able to act on it at the table at that moment. So that's why we've had to take that step. We would love to get any feedback since we're all here today. We did see that there's an edit to be made to one of the exhibits and would prefer doing that at planning commission rather than doing it at council after the public hearing. We did go to the CAC a couple weeks ago. We're not able to make any formal update, and they invited us to come back in January for an update, which we are planning to do. But I think that was really the one outstanding issue as far as the affordable housing, both at the CAC as well as at the Planning Commission. I know a number of you felt strongly about that at the time. And even though we got nearly a unanimous vote, I know it was a concern for you, and I hope that by adding that condition that it would meet your expectations.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Paul?
Well, so I appreciate that. I was the one no vote, and I am, I think, going to vote in favor of this application with the greater height. I think in this location, the height will make sense. But I don't think I raised the last time around, because I was going on about affordable housing, the preservation of CAM, which I think is your intention, the applicant's intention. And I think our comp plan does have some provisions, has some aspirations for large developments of this kind having performance space or arts space. That's my recollection from our comp plan update. If it doesn't, it should. So I think I'd love to see you write something into this case that guarantees that, if not literally the CAM is protected, that there is some provision of art space in this taller building. Thanks.
Yep, I have some concerns about 40 stories here. I know it's logistically, it's where it should go next to the train station. I agree with that. I just feel like, well, I guess I just have some reservations. I think, going from 5 to 20 seemed like a shocker to us, and there were other cases that came before you that got that height. And, I think it kind of sets the stage for all the warehouses to disappear over time. I'm not sure I'm opposed to it. I'm still digesting that. I am really pleased to see that you'd like to preserve the CAM structure. I don't think CAM necessarily has to be there, but to have the architectural original language there is really huge in helping to maintain the texture that exists in that warehouse district. So anyway, that's kind of what I'm mulling over.
I'd like to make a comment. In previous conversations, what I've shared is that if we can find a way to have that middle piece, and you've done that in terms of having it accessible to various income levels, which is wonderful, and the preservation and trying to preserve the structure of CAM as well as your modernizing. So I'm excited about what you have proposed, and I will be voting yes.
Anyone else? So I also will support this case as it looks now. I think this is the spot for density. 40 stories will be a shock, and I am concerned about the impact on the rest of the warehouse district. But, you know, with the push for more housing and affordable housing, we really need to look at where that can go. And because of the proximity of transportation here, it seems like the logical place. I applaud all the efforts to get affordable housing in there. I like the idea. I hope you'll still consider micro units because I think that's very affordable, and I hope that that won't get lost in the conversation. But we've been asked to hold the case until January 14th in order to get some conditions corrected, and there was an additional request for a condition that you might consider between now and then for the preservation of an art space, is what I heard. So did I miss anything other than we need to finish the process of hearing supporters and opposition? So,
just for clarity for the applicant,
okay.
Because it seemed like two different things are being talked about. Are we talking about the preservation of CAM, the building, or CAM, the art use? Is it the use or the structure?
I'm talking about the structure.
Talking about the structure. It sounded like you were
And I'm talking about the use, and not literally the use of CAM. I mean, things change over time, but that there be some provision in this large structure for an arts or performance space. And if it's not in the conditions when you bring it back, I'll vote yes anyway. So it's really just a suggestion.
All right. Any other thoughts to share with Mr. Paul? So we have 6 minutes left for any supporters that want to come forward. I'd ask you not to repeat anything that we've already heard today. 2 minutes per person if anybody wants to come forward to speak. Okay. Is there anyone here in opposition? All right. With that, I think we have to hold it at the table until January. Oh, there was one thing. So you're going back to the CAC in January. What's the date on that? Okay, so it's possible that you could ask for a vote there on the 6th. That would be much appreciated. They've heard this case before, so, I mean, the difference is the 40 stories, and I assume that they heard a little about that, even though you didn't get to do a formal presentation. All right, I'd appreciate it if we could get a vote from them in January. Thank you. All right, we're holding this one at the table. The next case is, sorry, somebody's going to get ahead of me because I'm taking notes too. Z3319 Corporate Center Drive.
Good morning. My name is JP Mansoff. Just wanted to introduce myself since it's the first time I'm seeing you guys. I'll be presenting Z3319 at Corporate Center Drive. This case was on the agenda in November 12th, and was deferred for a CAC vote. The request is to rezone approximately 22 acres from Office Park 4 with a parkway frontage and Special Highway Overlay District 1 to Office Mixed Use 7 with conditions and a partial removal of the SHOD 1 designation, which is a change from the previous iteration of this case. The CAC, West CAC recommended approval 10-0 with 2 abstentions, and your deadline for action is February 10th, 2020. So this illustrates the SHOD removal that was included in the request. So SHOD would require a 50-foot protective yard buffer along Interstate 40, which is on the west side of this parcel, which is the top of the screen. And it would also require buildings to be limited to 5 stories or 75 feet. And so this essentially retains the buffer along Interstate 40, but allows the 7 stories to be built in the portion of the site where the SHOD 1 will be removed, which is that 8.8 acres on the screen. Zoning in the area is predominantly office park west of Corporate Center, and then on the east side there's some mixed-use districts with the CX and RX districts. So just an aerial of the site. To the north is the recently opened Drive Shack, which is a golfing and entertainment facility. There's some large-scale office uses adjacent to the site in the Wells Fargo corporate office and North Carolina Judicial Center. So there's some medium-density residential in the form of townhomes and apartments mostly, and some large-scale institutional uses with Carter Finley Stadium and PNC Arena further to the east. And the town of Cary corporate limits is across I-40 to the west. There is a stream that runs through the site, shown here, that would require a 50-foot riparian buffer, just a site constraint, just wanted to bring to your attention. A couple of shots from the street. So the first photo is looking at the corner of Play Golf Way and Corporate Center. You can see the Drive Shack parking lot kind of in the background. And the second picture is looking north on Corporate Center. This is just showing the site as vacant, heavily wooded land. Proposed conditions include limiting office uses to 200,000 square feet. They're specifying allowed and prohibited building materials. A list of those is in the packet. Limiting each dwelling unit to 3 bedrooms per dwelling unit, and limiting buildings with residential uses to 5 stories or 75 feet in height. Just showing the existing entitlement versus proposed. The main takeaways here would be an increase in residential and retail uses. So residential would not be allowed under the current zoning, would be allowed under the proposed. So there's an increase in residential entitlement. Retail would also not be allowed under the existing zoning, but would be allowed under the proposed zoning, with the caveat that it would be limited to 15% of the gross floor area of the building it's located in, and that building would be required to be a multi-tenant building. Office entitlement would actually be reduced to 200,000 square feet from the previous zoning, just based on those conditions. The request is consistent with the future land use map. This site was a part of the subject property of CP 718, which modified the future land use map and changed it from office research and development to office and residential mixed use, and that was intended to sort of set the stage for this rezoning, and so that so this request is consistent with the future land use map. The urban form map shows this site as fronting on an urban thoroughfare and within a city growth center, and that pink doesn't show up very well, but it's within a city growth center, and so that would recommend urban or hybrid frontage. This request does not include a frontage, so it is inconsistent with the urban form map. Overall, it's consistent with the comprehensive plan, and again, consistent with the future land use map and inconsistent with the urban form map. List of policies. Consistent policies include references to mixed-use development, mixed-use areas, in addition to providing housing in close adjacency to potential job locations with all the office located nearby. Inconsistent policies, again, just going back to the urban form map and the inconsistency with the recommended frontage. Outstanding issues include the urban form inconsistency with no frontage being offered, and the deadline for action is February 10th, 2020, and I'm here to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Manzoff, and welcome to the team. So, any questions for staff?
Just to, again, to remind me, the limit on height for the residential buildings is 5 stories.
Correct.
And 75 feet,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for staff? All right, moving on to the applicant. You'll have 10 minutes to discuss your case.
Hey, Amanda Mann at the Morningstar Law Group. Happy to see everybody today. I'm going to try to be brief and save a little bit of time for our consultants if necessary. I have Tyler Morris and Jason Steele here with Capital Commercial, and I also have the team from J. Davis Architects for technical questions. As JP mentioned, it's a contemplated office, residential mixed use, office at 7 stories, capping the residential at 5. We feel like it's a great site. It's right off the highway. It's beside the Drive Shack. I also worked with the Drive Shack, and I can report that they were excited about the use as well, driving more folks to that area. It's been pretty straightforward to date. We've had a very positive experience with staff. We had good conversations at the CAC. We also went in front of the Blue Ridge Corridor Alliance on November 21st, and they were enthusiastic as well. I do want Ken Thompson to come up from J. Davis to talk a little bit about the site constraints. Our only inconsistency is I'm sure we're going to ask about, is the frontage issue. So there are some site constraints with the stream and what we think tree conservation is going to be required anyway at the site plan. So we feel like that's pretty much driving it. And that overall we're going to preserve as much as we can without the application of a frontage. But I'm going to turn it over to Ken to talk about that in more specific detail.
Please be sure to state your name too.
Ken Thompson,
and
J.
your
Davis
address.
Architects.
All right, thank you.
So on the office portion of the site here, the depth of the stream buffers is a constriction on the development of the property. If we went with like a parkway frontage, another item would be topography. The first 50 feet has 10 foot of fall. It kind of continues to that, and that's on an average. And a parkway frontage, would require us to provide 5 sidewalks along that frontage, which would need 150 to 200 foot of ramps to get down to the site. Some of the other frontages, the urban ones have a 20-foot build to. We believe that we're going to have tree conservation along the frontage for the first 32 feet. Similar to a shod, but this gives us the flexibility to manage the topography as we develop the site.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Thompson or Ms. Mann?
Just on the frontage, so you pointed to that particular area, but there's no frontage anywhere else on Corporate Center Drive either?
That's correct.
Because same issue?
Yeah, same items.
Okay.
The majority of the development's going to happen, residential would happen in that area. With some in that. We can accommodate like one building with the amenity and leasing office.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for the applicant or staff at this point? Okay, we'll move on. Is anyone here from the public to speak in support? Is there anyone here from the public to speak in opposition? So please come forward and state your name and address. You have 2 minutes.
Yes, ma'am. Good morning. My name is T.C. Morphus. I'm an attorney with the Bro Law Firm in Chapel Hill. I'm here on behalf of Bell Dakota Partnership and also Eaton Vance Management. My clients own the Dakota Apartments, which is located at the corner of Conference and Now, about probably a block from the site. And respectfully, as the project's been put forward right now, we ask that you recommend denial. Our primary concern is that the site currently doesn't allow any residential zoning or residential use. However, the applicant is proposing some office, some residential. But if the rezoning is approved, we believe that, and this is all respect to the applicant, what will happen is the residential components will be built and none of the mixed use components will be built. There's nothing in the current requirements of either the conditions or their application that requires the office tower actually be built. Eaton Vance and Bell Dakota support this area being a mixed use community. when they bought the Dakota in 2018, they looked carefully at the zoning surrounding the site and felt that the Dakota apartments were going to be a really good fit for a growing mixed-use neighborhood. So we're not opposed to the site being built, but we'd like it to be built as a mixed-use project. And we would ask either that it be denied or that you add 3 conditions that would guarantee mixed use. The first condition would be that office and retail, if there is any, be built either first or concurrently with the first phase of multifamily and other residential uses. The second be that there be a minimum office and retail square footage requirement. And the third be that because they're building multifamily, that a traffic impact analysis be required. Although there's data in your packets that says peak trips for multifamily are actually lower than from build out under office, we believe that with there effectively being no mixed use in the area, from all the apartments in the area, you're going to have a lot more trips of people going out, having to get all their goods and services outside the community, rather than being able to take advantage of that mixed use. So for those reasons, we would ask you either deny or add conditions. Thank you very much.
Where is Dakota Apartments?
Okay, so if you look at the highlighted
Can
part-
someone help him draw?
Yes, please. That would be great. Oh, wait a second. Look at that. That's fantastic. That's it. Thanks,
Yeah,
sir.
Thank you. Before you leave the podium, does anyone have questions for Mr.
Morphus.
Morphus?
Morphus. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. From Bro Law Firm.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Does anyone have questions?
What is the reasoning behind
It's
wanting
representing
to
that
have
apartment
office and retail built first or concurrently?
Well, our concern is right now, there's a proposal for office, and there's a proposal for residential. And as we understand it, the office would be built last. But there's nothing that actually obligates the applicant, once they've built the residential units, to then build the office.
Okay, to ensure that it's done.
Yes, ma'am.
And so there were 3 conditions. I caught 2 of them, a TIA
Okay.
require for office retail built first or concurrently, and what was the third?
And then a minimum office and retail square footage requirement.
All right, thank you, appreciate it. So, Ms. Mann, you have 2 minutes to rebut.
Sure, and I'll be briefer than that. I mean, we feel, we had one neighbor in attendance at the neighbor meeting, which was a different attorney for the apartment complex, and we haven't heard much since then. I feel like at this point it's sort of a competitive consideration. Obviously, we have to look to the market and costs and things at the time that the project actually goes into construction as to what happens and when. We think this is what we want to do, but we also understand that we've got to get through the site plan process and through the remainder of this rezoning process. And we believe that sort of this competitive consideration from an adjacent apartment complex is not really appropriate in terms of the decision here. We respectfully request that you approve it.
So, I have a question. You would not consider any of these conditions, these requested conditions?
Do you mind if I answer that? This is Tyler Morris, 3900 Merton Drive in Raleigh. We're the developer. No, we think those conditions are really just from a neighbor who is trying to stem competition, and it's just not applicable. Multifamily development and office development are 2 totally different development types and how you do them and build them out. Office will be totally dependent on finding tenants because pre-leasing is required, multifamily does not. And once the Drive Shack went in, that's what's piqued our interest in this site. We believe both multifamily and office will work there, but we're not going to commit to building the office first, which is an unknown. We can build the multifamily today.
Okay, thank you.
If you would, what kind of retail might you build
I don't
there?
anticipate any retail being there just because of where it is. It's sort of a destination site. The retail is the Drive Shack. I mean, we may have some like coffee uses or something like that as an amenity just in our multifamily, but it would be for the people that live there.
Thank you. That doesn't count because we're into questions. So, any other questions for Ms. Mann or Mr. Moore about what they've had to say? All right, let's bring it back to the table. Any further discussion that you want to have amongst us, or is someone ready to make a motion?
That idea had not occurred to me as I read this case. I didn't have any objection to this case. Actually did kind of thought occurred to me that this is off the beaten track for any sort of retail, so I agree with what the applicant just said. I'm ready to move approval, unless somebody wants to comment further.
So make sure you state your reasons for moving approval.
Okay, well, I will move approval of Z 3319 because it is consistent with the comprehensive plan and it is in the public interest to develop this site as proposed.
Do we have a second? Second. All right, any further discussion at this point? All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, moving on. We are going on to Z 3419, 3920 Glenridge Drive.
Good morning. The case is Z-34-19 at Glenridge Drive. It is a request to rezone about 5 acres from residential 6 to residential mixed use with a 4-story height and conditions. The last time you saw this case, there was one condition offered, which was to prohibit certain uses. It has been to the CAC, which voted to recommend approval if there were conditions that required there to be a fence along the boundary with home lots in the Brentwood neighborhood, as well as an undisturbed area along that same boundary. The applicant has revised the conditions to require a fence for that boundary, except in places where tree conservation is required, and then to also offer a wall adjacent to a single property at the corner where, at the edge of the property where it meets Glenridge, and I'll draw that for you. And as a reminder, it is a heavily wooded lot in the rear of the vacant Capitol Plaza Hotel site, and the request is consistent with the future land use and the comprehensive plan. And so the condition offered about the fence is essentially that there would be a fence in this area, and then this parcel here would be required to have a wall. But the fence could be omitted in the initial area if there's tree conservation there. And so that's the nature of that condition. I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right.
So that vote from the CAC wanted an opaque fence?
Yes, a 6-foot
an
opaque
opaque
fence. Typically in the way we enforce a fence requirement, there is a standard in the code that requires 100% opacity up to a certain height. So that certainly is something we can enforce.
Okay, good, thanks.
Is it safe to assume that the variability dependent on the actual parcel adjacency was a result of communication with those neighbors?
So in terms of the difference between a fence and a wall?
Yeah.
The nature of the wall, my understanding of that, and I think the applicant can probably respond to that as well, is that in that area of the site is very narrow, and so it is difficult to have a wide landscaped area in that portion of their site, and very, very difficult to have an undisturbed area in that portion. And so I think the wall is offered as a way of adding an additional barrier beyond what a fence would provide, because of that lack of ability to do something in terms of width.
Any other questions for staff? All right, I believe there was public input at the 26th of November meeting. Am I correct on that, Ms. Hicks? Yeah, so we've heard from the public up to now. So if we wanted to take more input from the public, we would have to vote for that. Is there anyone here from the public that wanted to speak on this case? Okay, so do you?
I'll move to give the public 2 minutes to speak.
Second.
Whichever way Mr. Mulder would like to speak.
All right. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay.
morning, members of the Planning Commission. My name is Robert Mulder. I live at 3116 Ward Road, Raleigh. I'm just around the corner from this rezoning request and also the rezoning request on Capitol Boulevard. I'm all for the redevelopment of both of these sites. I think it makes a lot of sense. The only thing that the interest was expressed by myself and my neighbors that there be a 50-foot undisturbed buffer wherever it's possible. I know it's an oddly shaped lot at one point, and that 50-foot landscape buffer would not work there. And that's really important. If many years ago when Highwoods was developed, the neighbors negotiated a 50-foot buffer between Highwoods and the neighborhood. And I live on Ward Road. If you do a Google satellite search, you'll see what the significance of that 50-foot buffer is. It's a wildlife corridor, and it provides a lot of shade and cooling. So I think that, and it's very important to the neighbors along those three streets, Glenridge Drive, Barwell, and Brentwood Road. But other than asking for an undisturbed buffer, and I don't mean I think somewhere in the code it says you can go into the buffer, but I don't support that. I think just a 50-foot wooded buffer, period. But other than that, I'm all for the project. There's been some concern about traffic. The traffic that this is going to add is like we've got a monsoon of traffic in Raleigh already. It's not going to change anything. This is just going to be a raindrop in that monsoon, and I don't have any problems. I'll deal with it, and I think my neighbors can also, but it makes a lot of sense. You're close to transportation. You can walk to work at Highwoods. I mean, what's not to like? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So is the applicant here so you can respond to the concern about the 50-foot undisturbed buffer?
Thank you. Molly Stewart, Morningstar Law Group, 421 Fayetteville Street. With respect to the buffer, I would simply note that under the current R6 zoning, homes can be built there today, requiring a 20-foot setback from that property line, from that common property line. We are expanding that area up to 50 feet with the rezoning, with the distance before you can place a building there. In addition, the requirement for an undisturbed buffer is incompatible with the requirement for a fence along that area. So we simply can't do both of those things. And also, given that we are not in site plan yet, there are some topography challenges on this site. If we were to do that 50-foot undisturbed buffer, presumably there would be additional area to protect the root zone of that area. And then we have our topography challenges. We're just simply not certain that we can accomplish that. So we've done what we can with the opaque fence, with the requirement for the wall, and then likely there'll be some tree conservation in this area as well.
Would that be undisturbed tree conservation?
To the extent there's tree conservation.
Yeah, that means it won't be encroached into.
That's right.
Okay, just confirming that that's the case, but we don't have a width for that. It's just some of it will be.
That's right. There are very detailed guidelines within the UDO as far as what will be considered tree conservation.
Okay, just wanted to get that down for the record. Thank you.
So what is allowed in that 50-foot buffer absent your conditioning it to be undisturbed?
Sure. That's our neighborhood transition. So there are 3 different options for how to accomplish that. In any event, the buildings have to be 50 feet away. So you could, there are kind of 2 zones within that 50 feet of neighborhood transition. And it's a sliding scale. You can have a narrow landscaped area with a wall right up against the property line, or you can have a wider area, and it can move down to a fence or to no barrier. Aside from our conditions, this is under the UDO. You can have that. You can also have within so that's kind of zone A. Zone B, between that landscaped area and the buildings, there you can have paved area. You could have parking. You could have a fire lane, that kind of thing.
So, right. So is there a way to write some sort of condition that would limit the amount of parking lot that you put in that 50-foot buffer area? I think that's maybe what Mr. Mulder is getting at.
I think that's right, and that is just something that we are not able to commit to.
table. Any discussion? Anyone care to make a motion?
Discussion, I want to vote for this case. I'm going to vote for this case. I think the point about the buffer is a significant one, so perhaps City Council will take some stronger action about that, or perhaps the applicant will offer something further as this moves forward. Without prohibiting any intrusion into the buffer, perhaps you could limit the degree of intrusion. But I will vote in favor.
Are you making a motion?
No.
Is anyone going to make a motion for this case?
Where's the verbiage?
Matt's looking it up.
Move approval, as this is consistent with the future land use map, comprehensive plan, and adding much-needed housing in an area that has planned transit.
Second.
Any further discussion? Go ahead.
I just wanted to add in support of what Bob said, it'd be nice to protect some of that undisturbed buffer if possible, mostly for wildlife.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Moving on to Z 3519 2815 Capitol Boulevard.
All right, this site is on the front portion of the Capitol Plaza Hotel site. It's about 8 acres, and the request is to rezone from commercial mixed use with a 5-story height limit and a parking limited frontage, with conditions to the same commercial mixed use base district, the same 5-story height, and a green frontage, and then some revised conditions. This is inconsistent with the future land use map, consistent with the comprehensive plan. The CAC also recommended approval of this case and requested a condition requiring a pedestrian connection from Capitol Boulevard to the rear of the site, which has been offered by the applicant. And I do want to refresh your memory of the considerations that had previously been in the conditions, which was about the applicant requiring some amount of public right-of-way to be provided within the site, vehicular right-of-way, and that was something that could not be enforced due to their unwillingness to actually offer a fully connected public right-of-way through the site, which would leave public right-of-way that is not connected to existing streets, which the city cannot maintain properly. And so noting that difficulty of enforcement, what they were willing to offer, they have removed that offer and simply exempted themselves from the block perimeter standard. So the way they've written the condition currently is that the public streets that exist today would constitute their block, and that would be conforming for our connectivity requirements. So no new public streets would be required if the case is approved as currently constructed. Now the Capitol Boulevard North Corridor Study has, in its initial proposals, which are not adopted by the City Council at this time, proposed a public street connection through this site, which would serve a potential interchange at Brentwood. And so that essentially creates a square loop like what you see at P Street and Capitol Boulevard. The applicant has provided a memo that's in your backup in the agenda stating that the public street connecting Capitol Boulevard to Glen Ridge would not likely be allowed by North Carolina Department of Transportation. Under other circumstances, that may be the case. In this particular circumstance, because North Carolina Department of Transportation is in the initial phases of planning to improve the I-440 and Capitol Boulevard interchange, they are considering a public street connection of the nature shown here to basically serve the Brentwood interchange that they could also propose as part of those improvements. Again, not an adopted plan, not binding in any development plan at this time, but something that is being considered. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Questions for staff?
So that potential street connection is not offered as a street right now. It's offered, and it's not offered as a pedestrian connection either, is it?
The way the condition is worded, it could be a private connection, but would have a public access easement.
Am I oriented the right way? I thought the pedestrian connection was from the front of the site to the back.
Yeah, so the pedestrian connection they're offering would be generally of this nature.
Right, right.
But it would not be required to allow vehicles.
Yeah, and that yellow stripe is the potential street.
So the yellow is Capitol Boulevard.
Oh, I'm sorry, okay.
This is Glen Ridge, Highwoods. And so the NCDOT project for the 440 interchange would potentially convert Highwoods and Westinghouse into a full intersection that would be actually a grade-separated interchange. Now, again, they're in the very early stages, so we don't know if they're going to propose that, but they have stated they'll consider that, in which case you essentially would have, if this becomes a public street, you can serve Highwoods for people traveling south, can make this movement instead of going through the interchange, and also could make a left turn using that connection as well. And so that type of thing does allow for an interchange to serve more vehicles than it would otherwise without that connection.
Okay, you've corrected my orientation there. So if they offer this as a pedestrian connection, it could be widened at some point. Are they barred from building in what could be a street in the future?
No, they have not offered a condition that would restrict having a structure in that area. And so that is kind of the concern is at some point in the future, if this public street is called for by one or both of these planning processes, then that creates an additional burden on these agencies to purchase more property and potentially have to purchase a structure that would then have to be removed if it's in the way of that street.
The hotel sits on that passage now?
Yes.
And
well, I'm looking at it on iMaps, and I measured it, and the street plan that's on iMaps is 300 feet from the closest property line for the site we're talking about.
I'm not sure I'm following the question. So this connection is not shown on the current street plan. This is a preliminary proposal as part of an ongoing planning process, the Capitol Boulevard North. So it's not adopted at this time.
So, but I do see an extension of Brentwood through, like, that you're showing there.
This connection is proposed on the street plan map.
Yeah.
Yes, that's been on the books for quite some time. And so that's not a surprise. The real question is this quadrant of a potential interchange here, this may be called for at some point in the future.
All right. So, to clarify, there's two planning processes, one led by NCDOT, one by the City of Raleigh, that are looking at this part of Capitol Boulevard, and both are contemplating potentially planning a street through this property. But they're not adopted, so if a site plan were to arrive for review tomorrow, we would have no guidance on any adopted street map to say you need to dedicate right away for the street. If block perimeter were effective, then there would be a avenue for a conversation about that street to meet the block perimeter standards because the site is located in an oversized block. Potentially, we would have to analyze it against the most recent text change to make sure that it actually applies to this particular site. Exempt from block perimeter, then if a site plan comes in and there's no street mapped, then the site could build out in such a way that would make that future street connection impossible, essentially taking it off the table, unless the plan is adopted, mapping a street in that location prior to a development plan being filed. So normally, we would not be bringing forth unadopted stuff from an area plan, but for the fact that this is using a unique provision in the code that allows zoning conditions to say we don't have to comply with what would otherwise be a part of the ordinance that we would have to comply with. And part of the implication of that is that it is potential for something that's currently under study to be essentially undercut by development that would place buildings within the proposed right-of-way.
Remind me, the application, are we sure the hotel is going to be torn down? Can it be renovated?
I would have to let the applicant speak to that.
Okay. Well, I know it's in horrible shape, but
It's been bombed.
yes, it has. That's true. And we're all looking forward to its removal. But just in case it isn't removed, then the street becomes impossible. But if it is removed, the street becomes very possible.
To speak to that, I think the prospect of a public agency providing the funding to acquire and remove the vacant hotel structure is a lower level of funding than would be required to acquire and remove a newly constructed occupied building. That is simply the money involved, I believe, would be significantly different.
Right. I'm on your side here. I'm trying to help make the case that room should be left for this street if we decide it ought to be built.
Is there any clarity on how this also ties into future BRT plans?
The Wake County Transit Plan does not currently call for bus rapid transit on Capitol Boulevard north of Crabtree Boulevard. That's the current terminus of the Capitol route. There is a possibility that at some point in the future that service could be extended further up Capitol Boulevard, potentially as far as Triangle Town Center. That is something that we are trying to account for in the Capitol Boulevard North Corridor study to be prepared if that does take place. And so one of the other proposals, again preliminary and not adopted by City Council, is that the Highwoods and Westinghouse interchange could also be the location of a bus rapid transit stop.
Okay, what's our pleasure at the table? Are we ready to, do we need to ask any questions of the applicant, or do we need further discussion? Are we ready to make a motion? I mean, it seems to me that we are a little stymied at the moment by how to move forward with this case, but I may be misreading the conversation.
Well, it obviously seems like it's it has become more of a key parcel,
Yes.
even though it's sat there vacant for who knows how long. It seems like that this is a rather high impact parcel, and so I guess I'd maybe want to hear, I guess there's two things. One is, what was the actual delivery timeline for the Peace Street? Just for relative context. I mean, wasn't that like 20 years?
For Peace Street?
Yeah.
Improvement of Peace Street?
I feel like it's been going on
construction of that interchange. So
from initial scope, from initial investigation to delivery. I mean, it's still being delivered, but
so it was adopted into the city's plans, I believe, around 2012.
Okay.
And it was known at the time that there was going to be a bridge replacement project for the bridges that carried capital over Peace Street. That went into design through NCDOT shortly thereafter, and then of course, we're still under construction now, although the light is at the end of the tunnel for that redesign. So it was a fair amount of change. The difference there is that this street alignment was not the extension of Harrington Street was created by public acquisition of the right-of-way and the construction of the street. The realignment of Johnson Street is being accomplished through the development of the Peace Project and other projects undertaken by Kane Realty in the vicinity. So it was sort of a mix. But you are correct, there is potentially a long timeline. This interchange is programmed for replacement, but construction will not start for a while, and they're still looking at alternatives.
I guess and maybe this is a question for the applicant as well, but I mean, I feel like these are things that we're gonna have to start thinking more critically about as we plan for heightened kind of node development, particularly around TODs and stuff like that, or BRT through TOD. And I know that there's a chicken and the egg thing, but I'm just curious if there's strategies or negotiations or development agreements or any more, like, I mean, that's like getting more sophisticated, but I wonder if there's ways that we can start to think a little bit more forward about some of this stuff, and if there are ways to handle these trickier situations where it is critical to the infrastructure of the growing city.
Right. So I mean, I think the thing that's in front of you is a zoning change, and absent this zoning change, the block perimeter might, would likely apply to the site. So, but that does not mean that a good development plan would be brought forth that might meet block perimeter, but would not include an alignment that would be optimal for this thing that's being discussed. So the from a timing perspective, it's somewhat unfortunate, and you have to decide, is it fair to the applicant to hold them up? But on the other hand, it is possible to build on the site without the condition exempting them from block perimeter. So I think those are the things you have to weigh. On the one hand, you're correct, the plan is not ripe. We have not mapped a right-of-way here. The NCDOT doesn't know exactly how they want to treat this portion of Capitol Boulevard yet. And so absent that, the landowner has a right to move forward with planning the project. But at the same time, they're asking for exception to an otherwise code standard they would have to meet that has some implications about the future of road planning in this area. And so it is a tricky balancing act.
So at this point, I would like for the applicant to come forward and comment about what the thoughts are with the condition to remove the block perimeter. And, you've heard the conversation, and I think you hear the angst about moving forward with this case with that condition being part of it. So what's your thought and response to this?
Thank you. I will also note that, Molly Stewart, Morningstar Law Group, 421 Fayetteville Street. I will note that Andrew Howe of Alliance Residential, the contract purchaser, is here with me as well, in case you have other questions for him. We also regret the timing of this compared to the planning for the connectivity in this area. We are not seeking to block that connectivity. It certainly remains an option. I do want to give you a little bit more background of how we've landed where we are today, which is that Alliance is targeting an 80% AMI market rate affordable project on this location. With that type of development, it requires a certain density. It requires surface parking to meet those cost targets. This site becomes very tight with those constraints, with the outdoor amenity that's required, things like that. Becomes actually quite challenging to fit everything onto the site. So that does a couple of things. One, while we're not ruling out the possibility of that public street connection in that location, we just need to get deeper into the site plan. And at this point, we can say certainly that we will provide a path. So there would be a path across the site at that location as the neighbors had requested. Another practical outcome of that is that in order to get the unit count that we're looking for, that we need on this site, a second access point will be required. So as you know, we originally did propose a condition requiring that public street across the back. It would have to connect through the neighboring property. So we're just not able to offer that connection, but we would certainly have to achieve it in order to build what we are looking to build on this site.
Connecting to the previous zoning case?
I'm sorry, one more time?
Connecting and through the back to the property that was in the previous zoning case?
In all likelihood.
Sorry?
In all likelihood, that would be the location.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, thoughts?
I mean, so I guess are there additional options to be able to kind of maybe, whether it's through amenity space or other things like that, to get a little bit more creative, to provide some, like, I guess, modest accommodation for future plans? Like, are there, knowing that we're not in site review, to help get ahead of some of this stuff? Because it definitely just eliminating site block perimeter, and maybe I'm not fully understanding it, but it seems like it takes, it adds a lot more unknown for me as to how it will be addressed relative to the future plans.
I think what I'm hearing is a request that there be something that leaves a building gap in the middle of the site. Is that?
I mean,
Yeah.
the best way to accommodate this growth pattern, even if it were to, maybe this is not the way, but there's an amenity area now, but that could be, even though it would take away some amenity, it would accommodate this new pattern in the future or something like that, where it still could be applicable today, but.
Yeah, I don't know that that's not possible. I will say one of the challenges that I see, just sort of off the top of my head, is that we've got a build-to there along Capitol, and so we are kind of pushing buildings up there. I'm not sure how big that gap can be. I just don't know the answer. It may be possible.
So would you be willing to wait a month for us to vote and go back and consider the possibility of offering a condition that would provide us with some comfort that there would be a way to deal with the public street that might come along in the future plans?
I would certainly like to offer our best efforts to come up with something in that area. I would ask not to hold it for a couple of reasons. One, there's no certainty that we can come up with that condition. And two, we have been held up previously for a couple of different reasons that were not in our control. And one of the other issues with getting to this, market rate affordable housing is keeping the process moving.
All right, so I think we're at a decision point. We need to move on this case one way or another. So with that, do we have further discussion, or is someone ready to make a motion to?
Wow. Boy, I hate to vote no on this. I really do. But I guess I'd be willing to vote no to signal to council when they get this case that there's some issue. And the issue is this block perimeter standard. And I think what Matt is talking about makes perfect sense, to define a space between buildings that can accommodate a street in the future if we want to build one there. Mr. Mulder is moving forward. I don't think we gave him a chance.
Well, we would need to vote him sometime, so do you wish to?
I would move that we hear from
Second. Thank you. Robert
Mulder,
Mulder.
who is, by the way, the former chair of this commission.
Wait, hang on.
Robert Mulder,
Catherine.
3116 Ward.
Wait,
Road.
hang
Sure.
on.
Your motion, what, 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
Okay. All right, and we had a motion and a second.
A second.
And all in favor say aye. Aye. Okay.
No, thank you. Robert Mulder, 3116 Ward Road. I think one overriding concern that you should all have about this is, again, I'm in favor of this project, but Fire Station 11 is almost done being renovated. The bays are taller and deeper. The trucks are going to be much, much larger. And so if you're thinking 20 years ahead, you better figure out how these trucks can get out and in terms of public safety. And if that means requiring a future corridor through the site, then you better consider that seriously. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mulder. All right, so is someone ready to make a motion? You can't sit on it forever.
Well, I guess I'm going to vote no, so I'm not going to make a motion to deny.
I mean, I feel like I still don't understand enough to actually make a motion one way or another. Like, this is information, I don't know if I missed it last time or what, but it seems relatively new.
Well, our choices are to hold it at the table for a month. And you've heard that they're trying to get affordable housing moving. So, or we have to vote. So one or the other is where we are at.
Let's just move it out. I recommend approval. And why is it inconsistent with the future land use map?
Needs a change to the future. It's community,
We've got,
needs to be changed to
John's coming
community
forward to
mixed
speak,
use from
Mr. Agnall.
some other
The
thing.
future land use map designation here is business and commercial services, which
Yeah.
envisions a
You're done.
that's a light industrial designation, so it doesn't really envision residential. And it specifically says if in the case that there is residential, it should not be on the first floor. And this case would allow, the proposal would allow residential for the entirety of the development.
Thank you.
Okay.
So what would, and I think community mixed use is what would be the recommended new district.
Right.
So are you going to finish your?
So this is, I recommend approval. It is consistent with the comprehensive plan. It's providing much needed accessible housing, but would like to make a note for council's consideration that we strongly look at and consider block perimeter and access through the site in plans for future auto and bus and any other sort of transportation that we will have in the future.
Second.
Any further discussion?
As long as that goes forward, I'll vote yes.
All right.
And with this, the notation too about the change in the future land use map.
Oh, yeah,
Reference in
sorry.
the staff report.
That recognizing that there is also a need for an update of the future land use map if this does move forward.
All right. Any further discussion? Okay, I too am conflicted about this because I think I'm concerned about the block perimeter and the transportation issues in the area, but I will vote to move it forward given that we are going to give that caveat. So any further discussion? Okay, all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, moving on. So we're going to TCZ 419 Old Town.
Good morning, Mark Holland, City Planning. This is a TCZ 4-19. It's to amend the conditions associated with zoning case Z7-18, which is approved under ordinance 871 ZC 768. This is for the development known as Old Town, which is from the map here is the 17 residential parcels that are located at the northeast quadrant of the New Hope Road and Rock Quarry Road. There are 5 zoning conditions that govern this property. They generally regulate the number of permitted dwelling units, the location and creation of public and private parks, the installation of greenway trail, and the use of the site for passive and active open space, and the location of the buildings within relation to Rock Quarry Road. The applicant is requesting to amend 2 of these conditions. Condition number 1 places a limit of 1,700 units, residential units on the property. These would be within the apartment building type. There would be at least, or up to, 300 of these dwelling units within the apartment building type, and that those would be dedicated to age-restricted 55 and older occupancy, and it would also dictate the location of those from the Rock Quarry Road right-of-way. Now, as amended, the 1,700 units, dwelling units, would remain the same, so there would be no increase in the overall number of dwelling units. But the apartment building type units would be increased to 360 units, and of those, 100 would be dedicated to the age restriction, as mentioned with the original condition. The 2,500 feet from the Rock Quarry Road right-of-way, that would remain in this condition as well. The second condition would be condition number 3, which details the installation of a greenway trail through the property. And the current condition states that it would be constructed prior to the issuance of the 200th certificate of occupancy. As revised, and this is the exhibit B associated with the original condition that shows the location of that trail. Condition 3, as amended, the trail would still be constructed, but it would be done in phases to reflect how the development takes place within the residential portion of the development. It would be divided up into 3 nodes or routes, and there would be thresholds for each of those. The first one would be the red node. And I'll go through these so you can see them on the map as well. The red node would be constructed with the certificate of occupancy being issued for the clubhouse facility. The green node, or the green route rather, would be constructed with the completion of the connection to Barwell Road, which is to the east here, the east and south. And the orange route would be completed with the issuance of the 1,500th certificate of occupancy. The applicant has presented this application to the Southeast CAC, and they did receive unanimous approval of their request. Staff is available for any questions on this, and the applicant is available as well.
Questions for staff? Seeing this as a new business, we do need to make the time for public input in the applicant. So the applicant has 10 minutes. And supporters, of course, so.
Thank you. Madam Chair and Planning Commission, Beth Trejos with Nelson Mullins here today on behalf of Old Town WEHLP, the new owner of the Old Town residential property. They purchased the property. You will recall that it was owned by a bank in December of last year, and as a knowledgeable developer, started reviewing the zoning approvals and doing due diligence with the community to kind of see what was available. Eric Rifkin with the Halley Companies, which is the parent company of this ownership entity, came to me and said, Beth, when we build an apartment complex, we'd like to have 360 units to support the amenities, the level of amenities that we'd like to provide. And that was sort of the starting point. We held a neighborhood meeting in March. We went to 7 CAC meetings. We went to the Southeast CAC 4 times, which is the CAC where this property is located. We went to the South CAC 3 times. The South CAC is adjacent. And so we, through the course of that discussion, learned additional information about what the community desired for this area. What we learned is that there is a need for senior housing, and so we added a commitment that there would be at least 100 units of senior housing. The existing zoning has no requirement for senior housing. We also learned that the city had rerouted the greenway in this area, and so we changed the location of the greenway to connect with what the city was now planning, a multi-use path on the west side of Barwell Road, so that we could connect. And, we recognize that this development is going to be built in phases, and so the greenway would be built in phases as well as portions of the development come online. As I said, we worked very closely with folks in the community. We had folks out to visit a apartment community very similar to this that the Halley Companies has built off of 1010 Road. We spent a lot of time, and we're pleased to receive the unanimous support of the CAC after those many meetings. We are hopeful that you will be supportive of the proposed changes as well, and we're happy to answer any questions you might have.
Any questions for the applicant?
Can you clarify what the threshold is for building the clubhouse, when that would occur in the process?
Sure. So there are actually plans in, as a part of the development, there are subdivision plans that include the roadway infrastructure, and one of those lots is the clubhouse lot. We talked with Mr. Holland yesterday about using language that would reference that existing plan to show that location of the clubhouse. So there's actually dirt moving on Old Town now.
So is that an additional condition you're talking about to add to the case, or?
No.
Okay, it's just,
no.
okay.
Yes.
All right. Other questions for the applicant?
No.
All right.
The construction of the clubhouse triggers part of the trail being built. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the thought is that would be one of the early features, the greenway path, the streets, and the path runs along the street, so it would be a part of that construction. And it's tied to the CO of the clubhouse just to, because that would be a part of it as well. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. We'll move on to see if there's anyone here to speak in support to members of the public. Is there anyone from the public here to speak in support of this zoning case? Seeing none, is there anyone here to speak in opposition to this zoning case? Seeing none, we'll bring it back to the table. Any discussion here, or are we ready to make a motion?
I'll make a motion. This seems to me a reasonable change in the zoning conditions, and given the tortuous path of Old Town to actual dirt moving, I would say this is not the most significant step in the process. So I'll move approval of TCZ 419 as being consistent with the comprehensive plan in the public interest. And there is a long statement of consistency provided by Mark Holland. And if I could just reference it in its entirety without reading it, that would be part of my motion.
Do we have a second? Second. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to TCZ 519-3708 Rock Quarry Road.
Again, Mark Holland with this city planning. TCZ 5-19 is located at 3708 Rock Quarry Road. This is to amend the conditions associated with zoning case Z19-17 as approved in ordinance 794 ZC 757. Again, it shows the locations at the intersection of Sunnybrook and Rock Quarry Road. There are 3 conditions that currently govern this property, and those reflect the or deal with the residential and minor utility, the maximum density of 14 dwelling units per acre, and the deeding of a transit easement to the city. This is a relatively simple change that they're making to the conditions. The condition 2 is sets a limit on the density of 14 dwelling units per acre. They're asking to change this this density to 29 units per acre. And they did present this to the South CAC on November the 4th and did receive a vote in support of that, but it was a split vote of 10 in favor, 3 opposed, and 5 abstentions. And it's my understanding that this is a development for some level of income restricted housing or income assisted housing. And it's also my understanding that the applicant had a conflict and could not be here today.
Oh, goodness.
Do you know what the opposition was at the CAC, the 3 and the 5?
It mainly dealt with, there were concerns about traffic, and there were some concerns about the type of housing. Some wanted to see a different type of housing at this location. There was some expression of not wanting to see an apartment or townhome as opposed to individual detached homes.
All right. Oh, sorry.
And do you know, when this originally was rezoned and it was approved less than 2 years ago, what was the rationale for limiting the application to 14 units per acre then?
It's my understanding that the applicant at that time is switched ownership since that time. And the original or the previous owner wanted to do townhomes on that site.
So not...
not an apartment
not lower,
type.
Not subsidized.
Yep.
All right, so we have no applicant today, but we will hear from the public. So is there anyone here from the public that would like to speak in support of this case? Is there anyone here that would like to speak in opposition to this case? Seeing none, I'm concerned about voting on this case without having heard from the applicant. What are your thoughts?
What's your deadline for action? And you could definitely hold it for comment from the applicant.
Yeah,
if you have time.
yeah, that's my preference if we have time. All right, so I'd like to hold this at the table until January 14th so that we hear from the applicant at that date. I'm reluctant to take an action without hearing from an applicant and having the opportunity to speak with them.
Madam Chair, just a comment. This strikes me as more like a brand-new zoning case than really a change to a minor zoning or to a specific zoning condition.
I think it is more like a rezoning, but these TCZs, we have made them part of the way that this can be done. So, and we are making them function like zoning cases by having CAC votes and
All right. Well,
hearing from the public. So
that's true. All right. Fair
Okay.
enough.
So, thank you. We'll hold this one at the table until the 14th of January. Moving on to Z3019, Lewisburg Road and Kyle Drive.
All right, hello. Good to see you again. Still Tuesday, I think. So this is new business request for just under 4 acres, currently split zoned R10 and R1, requesting neighborhood mixed use, 3 stories with parkway frontage. The North CAC has voted in favor, 44-0. It's a pretty strong vote in favor, and your deadline is in March. So there's actually quite a bit of commercial use already in the area. I'll get to in the aerial. So the zoning is mixed here, ranging from R1 all the way up to CX. There is some or a substantial amount of unincorporated land, including part of the site itself. So this is an aerial. All the brown that you see in the middle there is part of a subdivision called the Oasis, which is mostly, I believe, 33 or so single-family houses and a community center, which will go on that lot. So some of those are popping out of the ground already. So a dozen or so. This aerial is not quite as up-to-date as real life. There's also a large grocery store, Food Lion, and then the rest of this block is a mix of commercial. So there's a vehicle sales and vehicle repair, and then some detached houses. So a bit of a hodgepodge of uses and zoning. Just a bit of a clearer picture of what's currently existing. So I would mention now that so the subdivision at one point, or the Oasis, I should say, was owned and controlled by a single entity. Now some of the lots, the home lots, have been sold. All the lots on the zoning site, as well as everything that looks like that, is also controlled by the same entity. So these houses up here and this one down here are unrelated in terms of ownership. So just some photos, a little bit more up to date. That's the number 3 there is the parking lot, surface parking lot for the community center has already been paved. So the uses prohibit some of the more impactful commercial uses allowed in NX, bar, vehicle sales, and vehicle repair. They limit the size of any individual establishment to 10,000 square feet. So probably not going to get another Food Lion, but still a reasonable size commercial use. Limit to dwelling units to 30, and then there's a limit on commercial. It's in 2 parts, office up to 30,000 and every other commercial up to 50. So in theory, a total of 80, although I don't think that the residential and then 80,000 of square feet of non-residential is possible, but that's the flexibility of the entitlement anyway of what could go there. So a changing of currently 15 units allowed now, so doubling that density, and then in neither the R1 or the R10 would non-residential be permitted. So that's and that office cap is limited by the condition, and I think the other non-residential commercial use is limited by the site size really, and parking and everything else. So the request is inconsistent with the future land use map. The future land use map is moderate density residential, and so the NX zoning would represent an extension of the existing neighborhood mixed use future land use map designation to the south some. It is consistent with urban form, the parkway frontage, which is what is called for along Lewisburg. So consistent overall with the comprehensive plan, and policies are a bit split, so consistent with some policies about infill. So certainly neighborhood commercial is compatible with neighborhoods, as you might imagine, and zoning for housing and frontage. And some other ones that are not quite as consistent, the buffering requirements. So again, really going back to mostly what happens on this part of the site, adjacent to that detached house. Not overly concerned. Theoretically, they would have to buffer against themselves if they were to develop this today without rezoning, because neighborhood transition applies to vacant lots. But given that there's nothing there now, not the buffering and high impact commercial uses are mostly on the rear part of the lot. There's no additional conditions above and beyond code requirements for that. And so the difference between R1 and NX is substantial enough that flag those policies. But still consistent overall. Would require a future land use map amendment, as I mentioned, extending the neighborhood mixed use onto the entirety of the rezoning site. And no other comments from me. Happy to answer questions.
Questions for staff? Mr. Mabel?
Well, I didn't quite follow that buffering analysis, so for the slow learners up here,
sure.
Where should we be concerned that the buffering might not be adequate?
So in particular, that policy, the text of that policy says new development adjacent to areas of low intensity should provide physical buffers that may include setback, landscape forest, landscape strips, transition zones, fencing, screening, height, etc. So currently in the code, the neighborhood's transition yard applies when you're next to residential zoning. Yeah. So this lot here is zoned IX, so this portion of the lot would not require neighborhood transition, which is fine. Not overly concerned with buffering the auto shop in particular. Yeah. However, this portion of the site, well, those portions of the site are adjacent to R1. So the policy says new development adjacent to areas of lower intensity, and it doesn't get much lower than R1. And there is currently, a existing detached house there. So this policy would indicate that some enhanced buffering above and beyond neighborhood transition is appropriate for that.
And the owner of that house is not the applicant?
Correct, right. The applicant does own these lots here.
Right.
And, the community center and the rest of the subdivision.
Right. Okay.
So it's a bit of a nuance. There are multiple policies that I cite that all have the word infill in them, and some are consistent, some are not. I think the difference is, the types of uses permitted in NX are meant to be compatible with neighborhoods. So smaller scale retail. So in terms of compatibility, not too much of an issue given that they have prohibited some of the higher impact stuff. But in terms of, transition, the comp plan does suggest going above and beyond the minimums when there is a big difference. And so the difference between R1 and NX is pretty substantial.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Any more questions for staff? Okay, let's hear from the applicant.
Madam Chair and Planning Commission members, Beth Trejos, Nelson Mullins, here today on behalf of Sawwell Real Estate and Cozy Homes. Just to sort of orient you a bit more with this general area, immediately to the north is industrial zoning, and that is a car repair / rental place. There you see like U-Haul trucks and things like that there from time to time. There's a car dealership that up at the intersection of here, Lewisburg and Kyle, that's been there for a number of years. And the portions of the property that are zoned in this area, R1, were zoned in that way when they were brought into the city's zoning jurisdiction. I think it was originally, I don't even remember under the old code, but residential agricultural or something, a holding district in 1978, I believe. So doesn't reflect the current circumstance in the area. In terms of the future land use map, my client was involved in the larger development of this area, really with the intent of this property here being a mosque and community center. And I think that was the initial driver for the project. They thought, well, we can build some homes in close proximity to that. And then as they got to thinking about what was happening, well, it would also be nice to have some services and offices in close proximity to this place of worship and community center where folks will be regularly visiting, multiple times a day. And so the thought in this rezoning is to create an area where they could have some small shops and offices that would serve that community. In terms of the future land use map, our thought was, given the existing pattern, the industrial that's here, the car dealership here, that perhaps DOA would ultimately be a better demarcation of areas that are non-residential and those that are residential, and that we could provide a transition from the very intense industrial to the north through this property to DOA, and then the existing single-family homes that are being built and are actually occupied by many of the folks who attended the CAC meeting there. In terms of the transition, I don't believe that this property owner has engaged with us at all. We had our neighborhood meeting, I believe in March, possibly in April, but our neighborhood meeting, we went to the CAC 3 times, August, September, October, and I don't recall that this particular landowner spoke with us. We do believe that the restrictions on the nature of the uses, the code requirements relative to neighborhood transitions are sufficient, particularly given the existence of industrial immediately adjacent to the site. Again, the vote at the CAC was 44 in favor and 0 in opposition. We hope that you will be similarly supportive.
Thank
happy to
you.
answer any questions.
All right. Questions for the applicant?
Yeah, I don't have big concerns about this. There's a pretty good tree barrier between that house. I don't know who lives in that house. Maybe nobody.
I don't know.
But it is a house, and it's buffered from the industrial use west of it. It seems like it's almost buffered from your site by trees.
When you look at the GIS, the buildings are on the northern side of the site, so.
Buildings are on, yeah,
Yeah.
So what harm would it do to your application to offer some slight improvement to the code requirements for the buffer just right along that house's property line?
So I don't have the ability to offer that. Nobody has requested that of us, but certainly the code was designed with these circumstances in mind. And the buffers that were put in place were intended to create these transitions between neighborhoods and low-intensity, non-residential uses. So we would like to rely on the work that was done in the code to provide that transition.
Thanks.
Any other questions for the applicant? Well, let's see if there are members from the public here to speak in support. So there's still 7 minutes and 39 seconds for speaking in support. Seeing none, is there anyone here to speak in opposition? Okay, let's bring it back to the table. What's your pleasure? More discussion or ready to make a motion? All right, I'll entertain a motion. There's no discussion. Anyone? Bueller? All right. Let me find. Okay, thank you. I was going to have to go look it up. Go ahead.
I'll give it a shot. I will move to approve Z3019, looking at the GIS on this, and I think there's enough of a buffer on the adjacent property that probably no more is needed on your side. And we also have to make a comprehensive plan amendment, is that right?
Future land use map.
I'm sorry. Would that, right? Future land use map amendment. We are amending this from what? I'm not prepared for this motion.
I believe it's moderate density residential to neighborhood mixed use. That's what I saw in the staff report.
Okay, so yes, make that change to the future land use map, and I think both will be consistent with the comp plan. Both will be in the public, excuse me, public interest.
Okay. Do we have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay. Thank you very much. So we have deferred all the remaining zoning cases on the agenda today to the 14th of January. So we're moving on to the Planning Commission meeting minutes. Does anyone have any items on the meeting minutes or ready to make a motion to approve or deny? I'll make a motion to approve. Second. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? No. Okay. Are we up to the report from the chair or the planning director? Okay. Sorry, I'm getting back to my note. All right, so thank you for having a good meeting in my absence on November 26th. I have had a request from Jennifer Lampton to wish you all a happy holiday since she couldn't make the meeting today. Thank you for the 6 months we've been working together as I've been chair, so I look forward to the next 6 months into next year as chair. I hope you all have a Merry Christmas and a happy holidays. So just wanted to have that moment to say that. So now any report from the members?
I want to ask Ken or Bynum, do we have a regular date set for the strategic planning committee? Is there an ordinary meeting time for that?
I don't believe there is a meeting set.
It's not a meeting set,
There's not
but
a
is,
meeting set, and I don't believe we have a set time at this point, because I'm not sure I know who the chair is of that committee.
right here.
It's you.
There you go.
Okay. I'd be happy to talk with you after the meeting about your plans for the new year.
Well, yes, let's do that. So I was listening to city council the other day, and they have, Ken may talk about this, set a meeting for January 25th.
That's in Ken's report,
Where
yep.
boards and commissions are supposed to brainstorm their genius ideas and, right? Isn't that
Yes,
it?
Raleigh Unleashed, I believe. Is
Raleigh Unleashed, yes.
Yeah.
So I thought it would be a good idea for us as strategic planners to meet before that and set an agenda for the committee for the year. Talk about what we might look into, and then maybe that'll loosen our brains enough to be ready to unleash at the appropriate time and date, January 25th. So can we talk about that after? Okay,
Sure.
thanks.
I had a question about just committees in general.
Yes.
I feel like I've received, well, I guess I'm confused because what's published. I don't know if that is
Yeah,
correct
it
or not.
looks like it's reverted, doesn't it? It's gone back to the old one, so we had it right before they converted to the new web pages, so now it's wrong.
Okay.
I'm sorry. So they're going to get,
So do we have an actual list of committee assignments? Because I know
We
that so many
did.
people have come on and come off, and that it was in the last month or month and a half that it
yeah,
was-
we sent it out. I sent it to Travis, he sent it out. So it's in your email somewhere, and it was corrected finally on the previous web pages, which
wrong
now it's
again?
gone, yeah.
Oh,
Now
good.
all that's wrong with the new web pages, so and I'm glad you pointed that out because it's wrong. So we need to get that fixed because people are confused about what committees they're on.
So I guess, Mr. Gary, you're chair of 2 committees?
He is.
So it seems. Yes.
I
That-
feel like that.
Well, that was problematic because I couldn't get enough people to take the chair. So when we get new people to replace,
Okay.
because we're going to get a replacement for Mr. Novak, and hopefully one day we'll get a new person to replace Wake County. So I had said at that time, when we get people in,
Okay.
we would rejigger them. But right now, Bob volunteered to take both of those
Okay.
committees for the
I guess
moment.
that's why I was confused.
Yeah,
Okay.
so he,
Right, I'm willing to let loose of either one of them.
yes.
Okay.
So
Okay.
at some point, we'll work on them again, but
Okay.
because we were shorthanded,
Gotcha. Okay.
we had a problem with getting it organized.
Okay.
And so I had to get something out there.
Okay.
So anyway, that's where we are. So are we ready for the report from the planning director?
Sure. Update from the December 3rd city council meeting, there was a lot of items on the public agenda, or the public hearing agenda that evening. There were 7 items that were approved. Z3218, the South Saunders Plan Development. You may recall that there was a split vote from the commission to recommend denial, but the city council approved that case. Z719 Rock Quarry Road, Z1819 Ponderosa Service Road, Z2119 South New Hope Road, CP719 Sumner Boulevard, TCZ 319 3800 Glenwood Avenue, and TC 619, the text change for Section A3 of their Article A3 of the UDO design alternates. Those were all approved that evening. 3 items were scheduled for public hearing on January 7th. From your report, they were Z2219 on South and New Hope Road, Z2719 on Hillsborough Street, and TCZ 619 on Edwards Mill Road. You've received your requested 60-day time extension for CP 619 Blue Run Lane, and Z2319 Strickland Road was deferred to January 7th meeting to allow the applicant to provide revised conditions. In addition, the council has initiated a number of text changes to the UDO. They authorized a text change to reduce barriers to accessory dwelling unit development and a second text change to reconcile the UDO with the rewrite of the planning and zoning enabling statutes that was recently adopted in this legislative session. And it'll be effective a year from January. Council also requested staff to report back to council on any other barriers to development and investment, particularly related to changes of use in existing buildings. So we'll be preparing a report back to council on that, and a text change to zoning conditions associated with Z2517, which is office property on Park Lake Avenue near Crabtree Valley Mall, was authorized to move through the process. On commissioners, Commissioner Tomasulo has been reappointed, and we'll have a new commissioner at your January meeting. Blanny Ching Miller was appointed to the Planning Commission, replacing David Novak. We've already talked about Raleigh Unleashed, an event for the city's boards and commissions. We have a tentative date for it, which is January 25th. Don't have a lot of details, but the expectation is that representatives or the entire board will attend. Are you participating as a board? Are you participating as individuals? As more information comes available, we will provide it with you so that you can be adequately prepared, and also that should inform your discussion at Strategic Planning Committee.
So could you repeat what you said about Mr. Tomasulo?
He was reappointed.
To here?
To here.
As
a planning commissioner.
Replacing?
He's not replacing anyone, he's himself.
Oh, sorry, you. I'm sorry, I was thinking somebody else.
No.
Sorry.
Yes.
I had my names confused, sorry.
Gentleman
yes.
to your right.
The other.
Sorry. Yeah,
That's all right.
sorry. I don't know where my brain went. All right, so pending items, we have nothing left on the agendas for the subcommittees for December, right? Nothing. We have no.
That's correct.
All right, so we won't see each other again until the 14th of January unless there is a strategic planning meeting sometime before that.
Yeah.
All right.
And I guess
we'll put our heads together.
I did have just one other. I know we usually do, annual retreats.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know with so many new people.
We need to schedule that, but I was hoping we could get a Wake County rep, but we may have to, at the 14th of January, work out our retreat timeline.
Ken, do you have any update on the Wake County rep?
None.
No. Okay.
I was just going to offer that the Strategic Planning Committee's previously regularly scheduled time was the third Thursday of the month, which in January would be the 16th, which would be in advance of tentatively scheduled Raleigh Unleashed for the 25th.
At what time?
9 a.m. on a Thursday morning. And the other members of that committee that are currently present, besides yourself, is Ms. Winters.
No, that's wrong. Oh, well, that's right, because Mr. Novak. But we had 5 members on each committee.
Right, but like Ms. Lampman and Ms. McIntosh aren't here today.
Oh, you mean here today? Okay.
That's what I said, yep.
Sorry.
Mhm.
Like I said, I'm losing it here at the end of the day. I'm
It's been a long
I'm on
meeting.
cold medication, sorry. So, I got this far.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
All right, if there are no further discussion, I call this meeting adjourned.
So Bynum?
Yeah.
Shelley can make that, I can make it.